This might be the most incredible fairy tale in all of sporting history. It's about the country Ivory Coast and their star man who scored the goal that won them the African Cup of Nations. And he's breaking down in tears when he realizes what he has achieved and what he has been through for these past few years. But his story doesn't begin here. January 2021. Dutch side Ajax have just signed a 26-year-old player by the name of Sebastien Haller. And this man was the definition of a flower that had yet to blossom. But Ajax was the place where he would take the world by storm. In his first ever Champions League game, he would go on to score 4 goals, becoming the only player since Marco van Basten to ever do so. And just a few months later, he would become the only player alongside Cristiano Ronaldo to score in every single group game in a Champions League season. And after that, he would become the fastest player to ever reach 10 goals in the Champions League. And at the same time, he kept dominating the Dutch league, scoring 21 goals in 31 games, becoming top scorer and winning the league. In a year and a half, he scored 47 goals in 66 games, winning the league 2 times and dominating in Europe. It was now clear for the world that Sebastien Haller was a star, which caused Borussia Dortmund to pick up the phone, and on July 6, 2022, they signed Sebastien Haller. But just a few weeks later, he was diagnosed with cancer. When this man was at the very top of his career, in the form of his life, finally about to skyrocket, everything got put on hold. Everything that Sebastien Haller had been working for his entire life paused. Haller was forced to take a step back from football. And this was not exactly an injury. This was literally life or death. It all led to 2 surgeries and 4 months of chemotherapy. But even though he was going through all of this, he still showed up to support his team and even showed up to the games with his family. Because Sebastien Haller was determined to come back, and he would go on to train and rehabilitate day in and day out, harder than most footballers ever have. And amazingly, he recovered. And 6 months after his diagnosis, he returned. And on the 4th of February, 2023, on World Cancer Day, he scored his first ever Bundesliga goal for Dortmund. And now, almost exactly 1 year later, he scored the winning goal to give his Ivory Coast the African Cup of Nations on home soil. The Ivory Coast team that did it against all odds, in the most insane AFCON tournament we have ever seen. But the tournament was on its way to become a catastrophe for the Ivorians. After losing 1-0 to Nigeria, and then 4-0 against Equatorial Guinea in the group stage, there was barely any hope left for Ivory Coast. They even fired their head coach in the midst of the tournament. And the only way they could advance was only if they could end up as a best third in their group. And the only way for that to happen was if Mozambique would take a point in their game against Ghana, which looked impossible because in the 90th minute, Ghana had a comfortable 2-0 lead. But in the most miraculous way, Mozambique scored in the 91st minute and then equalized in the 94th minute, and the game ended 2-2, eliminating Ghana and sending Ivory Coast through to the knockout stages. But now Ivory Coast faced an even bigger challenge, the reigning champions, Senegal, in the round of 16, and the Senegalese team took the lead after only 4 minutes, a lead that they held until the 86th minute, with only 4 minutes left, where Franck Kessie would equalize. And Ivory Coast would eventually go on to win 5-4 on penalties. A penalty shootout where Haller scored his penalty. In the quarterfinals, they faced Mali, and in the first half, Ivory Coast had arguably their best defender, Odilon Kusunu, sent off. And in the 71st minute, Mali would score. With Ivory Coast being down 1-0 with less than 20 minutes left with 10 men, it looked once again as if all hope was gone. But in the 90th minute, they equalized. And on extra time, in the last seconds of the game, in the 122nd minute, Ivory Coast scored again, winning the game 2-1, in what will go down as one of the most dramatic games of football ever played. In the semi-final, they would face Congo. And until this match, Sebastien Haller had yet to score a single goal in this tournament. But when it mattered the most, he stepped forward and scored this magnificent volley that won Ivory Coast the game 1-0 and sent them to the final. A final where they would face Nigeria, who they had lost to in the group stage. And this time, Ivory Coast would find themselves trailing again, as Nigeria scored in the first half. But in the second half, Frank Kessie equalized. And with 10 minutes left, Sebastien Haller stepped forward again, on the biggest stage of them all, and scored this acrobatic wonder goal. The goal that won Ivory Coast their third AFCON title. Through the man who barely a year earlier had cancer. The man who stared death in the eye and said, "No, not me. It's not my time." And would 1 year later, against all odds, win Africa's biggest title in front of the world. And to